And welcome back. In this tutorial, we're going to cover the extrude command. So extrude is one of the most common ways that we make a solid, and extrude requires a valid closed sketch. And so basically a valid closed sketch is a sketch that's closed that has literally no opening. So easiest example of a completely closed sketch is going to be a circle. There's no openings in a circle. Rectangles work the same way. Polygons also work the same way. So when we covered polygons under sketch geometry creation, those are by default closed. Where you can get into trouble is when you are drawing things by hand and you're clicking endpoints and something just doesn't line up quite right. A constraint isn't put in. So think of a valid closed sketch as a bucket. If a bucket has a hole, even if it's a small hole, and you try to fill it with water, it can only fill to the location of the hole. And it might fill over, but eventually the water will drain through the hole. And so that sketch is kind of the same way, that you cannot have any openings no matter how small. So think of it in terms of that. If you get an error, a lot of times it's because you don't have a closed sketch. So what we need to do first is make a sketch, and we're going to make a sketch on our top work plane. And again, I've said this before, but please pay attention to make sure that the word top reads correctly. Top view sketches in Inventor, for some reason, do not read correctly. They rotate 90 degrees. So we're going to go ahead and rotate our view cube 90 degrees. And next step is project all three planes. Remember, your part is going to look like this. So we expand origin, click all three planes until we get our plus sign. Good habit to be in. Let's talk about saving for a minute. You cannot save a part in sketch mode while you're in Inventor. So one thing that CAD programs love to do, it's universal, it doesn't matter what program it is, what application it is, CAD programs like to crash. And of course they never crash at the optimum time, or they never crash right after you saved. They always crash after you've been working on something really difficult for 45 minutes, you forgot to save because you were just in the groove, and all of a sudden, boom, it locks up. So what I would recommend is, to all my students, I tell you guys this. Save when you're done making a sketch before you make a solid. After that solid is done, save again. If you get in that habit of just hitting Control S, Control S, Control S, it's going to save you a lot of time. Now, CAD crashes on everybody, and it happens to me still, even though I preach it all the time, and I do lose some work. So no one's immune to it, but just try to get in that habit of every time you finish a sketch or finish a solid, go ahead and hit save. So we're going to put in a center point rectangle, and give it some dimensions real quick. Let's make this 3 by 1.5. That looks good. So we're fully constrained. We'll hit finish sketch, and now I would save. Okay, so I'm not going to go ahead and save all these files. I don't need them, but just get in that habit of right now hit Control S and save it. Next step is to click extrude. And so we look at our dialog box, and when it comes to dialog boxes, I like to work them top to bottom, left to right. So here we've only got one kind of column here. Some other dialog boxes will have more than one column. So it's asking me for two things. It wants to know a profile, and I get this little exclamation mark in this red triangle, and it wants a face. So let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click 1, 2, 3, 4 rectangles. Now notice that both of my extrusions went away because by clicking those, I gave it a plane to sketch, a sketch plane to extrude from, and I also gave it 4 different profiles of my rectangle. Next, down here we have behavior, which is direction. Okay, default direction is to go up in this case. Clicking the next box over will flip it to go down. The next box is symmetric, and what symmetric does is it puts it half on one side of the plane and half on the other. So regardless of the dimension I type in here, if I make this 2 or if I make it 3, it's always going to be the same. Now, the last one is asymmetric. This is a pretty handy tool. This lets us go 2 different dimensions on the opposite sides of the plane. So let's say we went 1.5 and we went 0.5, and when I click in my boxes, you can see that I get a nice dialog box with a dimension here that I can enter my text in if I'm confused on which side is which, or if my dimensions are a lot closer. If you're off by maybe a tolerance of a machining tolerance of a couple of thousandths of an inch, that's not easy to see. This is a good way to take that into consideration. And I also have an option over here for 2. And we'll use 2 later, but basically what 2 is 2 is looking for some kind of a reference. So if I had another plane or another solid, and I said, oh, I want to extrude down to that different piece of geometry, I can do that. My last option here is to add a taper, so I can add, let's say, a 5-degree taper, and we can see here that 5 degrees goes that way. And if we add a negative 5-degree taper, it will taper in along the extrusion with my original dimensions remaining the same. So let's go ahead and let's hit OK. So now I've got this extrusion with a taper on it, and I realize I just need a rectangle. We talked a little bit ago in another video about modifying sketches, and I said, you would never start a new test to do test corrections on a test you took for, let's say, history. You will never need to start a new extrusion in order to modify an extrusion that we already have. So if we take a look at our model tree, we see extrusion 1, and that has consumed sketch 1. Okay? So now sketch 1 is not visible anymore, and it is consumed by extrusion 1. In order to modify the size of my base, I would have to go in, double-click my sketch. Notice that my solid goes away because chronologically it doesn't exist. I can change this to, let's say, 4, and then we'll finish sketch, and now my rectangle is longer. If I need to change the thickness, which is my extrusion length, or that angle, I have to double-click extrusion 1 or right-click, edit feature. Be careful that you don't double-click on the text. I like to double-click the icon. If you double-click the text and you do it a little too slow, sometimes it asks you to rename the feature, which is no big deal. It's just not accomplishing what we want. Let's go ahead and change our taper back to 0. We'll hit OK, and we can see now that we've got our rectangle. We can also sketch on top of this geometry or any of the 6 sides. And let's say we want to extrude a circle right off that. Let's dimension it with a dimension of 1. And we'll finish and we'll extrude. And now, by the way, the shortcut for extrude, the keyboard shortcut is E. So notice I didn't go over to extrude, I just hit E. And so we can now see that we've got a profile and a sketch plane. Now, how did that happen? Why didn't I have to pick the circle? I didn't have to pick the circle because it was my only valid closed profile. So it's not like I had 4 quadrants of my circle that I could pick from. So it automatically picked it for me. My operations are still the same. My distance, let's go ahead and set that to 0.5. And now I've got an option to extrude through all. This is if I was going to make this a cut. 2 and then 2 next. We'll get into 2 and 2 next down the road. I do also have an option here to cut, and I have an option to intersect. My last one is to create a new solid. We're going to get into these later. For right now, just know that I can make this a cut into my material. Please do not do this with circles. Circles need a hole command. We'll get into the hole command down the road right here. But let's say that this was going to be a, let's make it interesting. Let's make a polygon. So let's go ahead and make a hexagon, and it's going to be off of my origin. We're going to put a horizontal constraint to rotate it. And then let's put a dimension across my flats of 3/4 of an inch. Now as I finish that sketch and I go to extrude, the same thing will happen. It will automatically pick this because it's my only valid closed profile. And now I can make a cut into my material. And as I hold down Shift and click my mouse button in to orbit, I see that indeed I have a hexagon shaped cut. So that is solid creation using an extrusion and the cut methodology as well. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next video.